She left one message before vanishing. Just 8 words that would haunt everyone who knew her. "I'm in trouble. Please help me." Then silence. Complete, terrifying silence. What happened to Arlyn Nusbron, the soft-spoken Filipina nanny who traveled thousands of miles from her home to build a better life in Dubai, remains one of the most disturbing mysteries the city has ever seen. But this isn't just a story about a disappearance. This is a story about secrets, obsession, and how quickly dreams can turn into nightmares when you trust the wrong person. Dubai, the city of gold, towering skyscrapers, and impossible dreams. Every year, thousands of Filipino workers arrive here, hoping to earn money to send back home to their families. They work as domestic helpers, nannies, and caregivers, often sacrificing years away from their own children to provide for them. Arlyn was one of them. She was 31 years old when she made the decision to leave the Philippines. Back home, she had a daughter, just 7 years old, who needed a good education and a better future. Like so many mothers before her, Arlyn made the heartbreaking choice to say goodbye, promising her little girl that mommy would come back soon with enough money to change their lives. When Arlyn arrived in Dubai in early 2014, she was hired by a wealthy local family to take care of their children. The family lived in a luxurious villa in one of Dubai's most exclusive neighborhoods. The kind of place where security guards stand at every gate, where marble floors shine like mirrors, and where the monthly rent costs more than most people earn in a year. For Arlyn, it must have felt like stepping into a different world. She was given her own small room in the villa, 3 meals a day, and a monthly salary that she could send back to her daughter. It wasn't easy work. The children were demanding, the hours were long, and she was always on call. But Arlyn was determined. She called home every week, talking to her daughter, telling her about the tall buildings and the desert heat, promising that soon they would be together again. But somewhere along the way, something changed. According to friends Arlyn confided in, she began spending more time with the man of the house. Let's call him Rashid, though that's not his real name. Rashid was a successful businessman in his late 40s, wealthy beyond imagination, with connections that stretched across the Middle East. He owned multiple properties, drove expensive cars, and moved in circles where $1 million was just another business deal. His wife was often away, traveling with the children or visiting relatives. And in those quiet moments when the villa felt empty, Arlyn and Rashid started talking. At first, it was innocent. He asked about her family, her life back in the Philippines, her dreams. She was kind, attentive, and probably grateful for someone who treated her like a person rather than just hired help. What happened next is where the story gets complicated and where different people tell different versions. Some say Arlyn fell in love. Others say Rashid manipulated her, using his power and wealth to control a vulnerable woman who was alone in a foreign country. The truth is probably somewhere in between. What we know for certain is that by mid-2014, Arlyn and Rashid were having an affair. She stopped calling home as often. When she did call, her daughter noticed she sounded different, distracted, worried. Her friends in Dubai's Filipino community said she seemed scared but wouldn't explain why. One friend remembered Arlyn saying something strange during their last meeting. "If anything happens to me, it's because I know too much." When her friend pressed her to explain, Arlyn just shook her head and changed the subject. In September 2014, Arlyn sent that final message to her cousin in the Philippines. 8 words. "I'm in trouble. Please help me." Her cousin immediately. But Arlyn's family knew something was wrong. If she had decided to go back to the Philippines, why hadn't she contacted them? Why hadn't she shown up at home? Her passport was registered with the Philippine embassy, and there was no record of her leaving the UAE. Immigration had no exit record for her. Her bank account, which she had regularly used to send money home, hadn't been touched since mid-September. It was as if she had disappeared into thin air, leaving behind only that one desperate message and a trail of questions that nobody seemed willing to answer. Dubai police launched an investigation, but from the beginning, there were problems. Rashid was a powerful man with influential friends. People who asked too many questions were told to be careful. Some of Arlyn's friends in the Filipino community wanted to speak out, to demand answers, but they were afraid. They were foreign workers in a country where rocking the boat could mean losing their jobs and getting deported. They had their own families to think about, their own children depending on the money they sent home every month. The investigation into Arlyn's disappearance should have been straightforward, but nothing about this case was simple. As Dubai police dug deeper, they uncovered a web of lies, secret relationships, and a double life that Arlyn had been living in the months before she vanished. What they found painted a picture far more complicated than anyone had imagined. This wasn't just about a nanny who had gone missing. This was about a forbidden relationship in a society where such things could destroy lives, about power imbalances that left vulnerable people with nowhere to turn, and about secrets that some people would do anything to keep buried. When investigators started interviewing people who knew Arlyn, a disturbing pattern emerged. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Arlyn and Rashid had been involved in a romantic relationship for at least 6 months before her disappearance. But this wasn't some casual workplace flirtation. According to friends Arlyn had confided in, she believed Rashid was going to leave his wife for her. She talked about him constantly, showing them expensive gifts he had given her, jewelry and perfumes that she could never have afforded on her nanny's salary. She told them he had promised to set her up in her own apartment, to help bring her daughter to Dubai, to give her a life beyond scrubbing floors and changing diapers. For a woman who had spent years sacrificing everything for her child, who sent almost every penny home and lived in a tiny room with hardly any possessions to call her own, these promises must have seemed like a fairy tale coming true. But her friends were worried. They had seen this story play out before, too many times in Dubai's expatriate community. Wealthy local men having affairs with their domestic workers, making promises they never intended to keep, then discarding these women when things got complicated. They warned Arlyn to be careful, to protect herself, to remember that she had no legal standing in this relationship. In the UAE, extramarital affairs are illegal. If anyone found out about what was happening, Arlyn could be arrested, jailed, and deported. She could lose everything. Rashid, on the other hand, with his money and connections, would likely face minimal consequences. The power dynamic was clear to everyone except, perhaps, Arlyn herself. One of Arlyn's closest friends, a fellow Filipina domestic worker named Maria, gave a statement to police that shed light on Arlyn's state of mind in the weeks before she disappeared. Maria said that Arlyn had become increasingly anxious and paranoid. She suspected that Rashid's wife had discovered the affair. There had been incidents at the villa, arguments behind closed doors, tension that everyone in the household could feel, but nobody dared speak about openly. Arlyn told Maria that Rashid's wife had confronted her one evening, accusing her of seducing her husband, threatening to have her arrested and thrown in jail. Arlyn had been terrified. She wanted to quit, to leave the villa immediately, but Rashid had convinced her to stay. He told her he would protect her, that his wife was just upset but would calm down, that everything would be fine. But everything was not fine. According to Maria, Arlyn had discovered something that changed everything. She wouldn't tell Maria exactly what it was, but she said it was big, something that could ruin Rashid if it came out. Maria remembered Arlyn's exact words because they had frightened her so much. "He's not who I thought he was. He's done terrible things. If people knew what I know, he would lose everything." When Maria asked what she meant, Arlyn refused to elaborate. She just kept saying she needed to be careful, that she needed to figure out what to do with the information she had. Looking back, Maria believed that Arlyn might have been trying to use whatever she had discovered as leverage to force Rashid to keep his promises or perhaps to ensure her own safety. Police investigators wanted to know what Arlyn had discovered, but finding answers proved nearly impossible. When they searched the villa with a warrant, looking for any trace of Arlyn or evidence of what might have happened to her, they found nothing. Her room had been completely cleared out. Not a single piece of clothing, not a photograph, not even a stray hair tie. It was as if she had never existed in that space. The other household staff claimed they had no idea what happened to her belongings. Rashid maintained that Arlyn had taken everything with her when she left. But how does someone pack up their entire life and walk out of the villa in one of Dubai's most secure neighborhoods without anyone seeing them? The security cameras that should have recorded everyone coming and going from the property had mysteriously malfunctioned on the day Arlyn supposedly left. The footage was corrupted, unusable, a convenient technical failure that investigators found highly suspicious. The case started attracting attention beyond Dubai. Filipino community organizations began holding vigils for Arlyn, demanding answers, pressuring both the UAE and Philippine governments to do more. Her story was picked up by Filipino news outlets, and suddenly Arlyn's face was everywhere, her daughter's tearful pleas for her mother to come home broadcast across the Philippines. The pressure forced authorities to dig deeper, and what they uncovered about Rashid's background raised even more red flags. Rashid, it turned out, had a history. This wasn't the first time he had been involved with domestic workers in inappropriate ways. Police discovered that at least 3 other Filipino women who had worked in his household over the years had left suddenly under mysterious circumstances. One had filed a complaint claiming sexual harassment before abruptly withdrawing it and leaving the country. Another had disappeared for 2 weeks before turning up at the Philippine embassy, traumatized and refusing to speak about what had happened to her. She was quickly repatriated to the Philippines, and the matter was quietly dropped. A third woman had died under circumstances ruled accidental, though her family had always maintained something more sinister had happened. When investigators tried to interview these women, they hit dead ends. One refused to talk, hanging up the phone as soon as Arlyn's name was mentioned. Another said she had been paid to keep quiet and feared for her safety if she spoke out. But Arlyn's family refused to let her memory be tarnished. Her mother, a dignified woman in her 60s who had already buried one child and couldn't bear the thought of losing another, flew to Dubai to demand answers. She held press conferences outside the Philippine embassy, clutching photographs of Arlyn as a little girl, as a young mother holding her own daughter, as a hopeful woman boarding a plane to Dubai with dreams of a better future. She told reporters that her daughter was not the person Rashid's lawyers were describing. Arlyn had been a devoted mother, a responsible worker, someone who sent money home like clockwork every month. She had no debts, no secret boyfriend, no reason to simply vanish without telling anyone. The mother's grief was raw and genuine, and it cut through the carefully constructed narrative that Rashid's team had been building. The pressure from media attention and the Philippine government's involvement forced Dubai police to intensify their investigation. They brought Rashid in for formal questioning multiple times. During these interviews, his story began to shift in small but significant ways. At first, he had said Arlyn left on a morning in mid-September, taking all her belongings with her. But when pressed for specific dates and times, he became vague. He couldn't remember exactly which day it was. He wasn't home when she supposedly left, he claimed. He had been in his office. His wife had told him about it later. But when investigators questioned his wife separately, her timeline didn't match his. She said he had been home that morning, but they had both been there when Arlyn left. When confronted with this inconsistency, Rashid changed his story again. Maybe he had been home, he said. It was hard to remember. It had been a stressful time. These contradictions were red flags that any experienced investigator would recognize. Meanwhile, investigators were trying to piece together Arlyn's final days through phone records and witness statements. Her mobile phone data showed that in the week before her disappearance, she had been making frequent calls to a number registered to a Filipino man named Daniel Santos. When police tracked down Daniel, he told them a story that cast everything in a different light. Daniel had been a friend of Arlyn's, someone she had met through the Filipino community in Dubai. He said Arlyn had contacted him in early September, asking for help. She told him she had obtained documents that proved Rashid was involved in illegal business dealings. She didn't give Daniel all the details, but she said she had copied files from Rashid's home office, financial records and communications that showed he was laundering money through his businesses. She had kept digital copies on a USB drive that she carried with her everywhere. Daniel said Arlyn had been trying to decide what to do with this information. Part of her wanted to go to the authorities, but she was terrified of what might happen to her if she did. She was in the country on a work visa sponsored by Rashid's family. If she accused him of crimes, he could have her visa canceled and her deported before any investigation even began. She would lose her job, her income, and any chance of justice. On the other hand, if she kept quiet, she was essentially an accomplice to whatever illegal activities he was involved in. Daniel advised her to leave Dubai immediately, to go to the Philippine embassy and ask for help getting home safely. But Arlyn had hesitated. She had been in Dubai for less than a year. She hadn't saved much money yet. Going home now felt like admitting defeat, like failing her daughter. Plus, she told Daniel something that made him extremely uncomfortable. She said Rashid had promised her money to keep quiet, a substantial amount that would be enough to build a house in the Philippines and secure her daughter's education. She was considering taking the deal. This revelation complicated the investigation even further. If Arlyn had been trying to blackmail Rashid, it gave him a clear motive to want her silenced permanently. Blackmail was a dangerous game, especially when you were playing it against someone with unlimited resources and no conscience. Daniel told investigators that the last time he spoke to Arlyn, just 2 days before she disappeared, she sounded scared. She said she was meeting Rashid that evening to discuss the terms of their arrangement. She promised to call Daniel afterward to let him know how it went. That call never came. Armed with this new information, police obtained warrants to examine Rashid's financial records. What they found supported Daniel's claims. Rashid's businesses were a complex web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and suspicious transactions. There were payments to individuals with known criminal connections, transfers to accounts in tax havens, patterns consistent with money laundering operations. Financial crimes investigators estimated that tens of millions of dollars had been moved through these schemes over several years. If Arlyn had indeed obtained evidence of these activities, she had stumbled onto something far more dangerous than a simple extramarital affair. She had uncovered criminal operations that could send Rashid to prison for decades and destroy his entire business empire. But here's where the investigation hit another obstacle. Rashid had powerful friends, including people in government positions and law enforcement. Suddenly, the financial crimes investigation was transferred to a different department. The new lead investigator seemed far less interested in pursuing the case aggressively. Meetings were canceled, evidence requests were delayed. Witnesses became unavailable for interviews. It became clear to the original investigators that someone with influence was interfering with the case. Anonymous tips began coming in, suggesting they should look at other suspects, that Arlyn had been involved with dangerous people in the Filipino community, that her disappearance had nothing to do with Rashid. These diversionary tactics were transparent to experienced investigators, but they still had to follow up on every lead, wasting precious time and resources. Months passed with no breakthrough. Arlyn's mother had to return to the Philippines, heartbroken and defeated. Her daughter's case was going cold, and there seemed to be nothing she could do about it. The Filipino community in Dubai continued to hold vigils and prayer gatherings, but media attention was fading. News stories were capturing headlines. People were forgetting about the nanny who had disappeared, if they had ever cared in the first place. Domestic workers go missing all the time in cities like Dubai, some said. Most of them turn up eventually, or they just went home without telling anyone. It was easier to believe that than to confront the darker reality that a woman might have been murdered and that her killer was walking free because he had enough money to make problems disappear. But then, 8 months after Arlyn vanished, something happened that brought the case roaring back to life. A construction crew working on a new development project in the desert outside Dubai made a horrifying discovery. They had been excavating land for the foundation of a luxury resort when one of the workers noticed something unusual in the sand. It was a piece of fabric, partially buried, brightly colored in a way that seemed out of place in the monochrome desert landscape. When they dug further, they found more fabric, and then something that made the foreman immediately call the police. It was a body, or what remained of one after months in the desert heat. The corpse was badly decomposed, barely recognizable as human, but there were some items buried with it. A small silver necklace with a crucifix, the kind that millions of Filipinos wear as a symbol of their Catholic faith. A cheap plastic watch that had stopped at 11:37. And most damning of all, scraps of identification documents, deteriorated but still partially legible, bearing the name Arlyn Nusbron. The discovery of the body in the desert changed everything. What had been treated as a missing persons case, something that officials could quietly let fade away, was now undeniably a murder investigation. The remains were transported to Dubai's forensic laboratory, where experts worked to extract whatever evidence they could for what the desert had left behind. It wasn't easy. Months of exposure to extreme heat, sand, and scavenging animals had done significant damage. But forensic science has come a long way, and even badly decomposed remains can tell a story if you know how to read them. The first priority was confirming the identity of the victim. DNA samples were taken and compared against reference samples provided by Arlyn's mother. The results came back positive. The body found in the desert was definitely Arlyn Nusbron. The news hit her family like a physical blow. Part of them had been holding on to hope, however slim, that maybe Arlyn was alive somewhere, that maybe she had run away and started a new life, that maybe one day she would come home. Now that hope was gone, the little girl who had been waiting for her mother to call, who had been asking every day when mommy was coming home, would never see her mother again. The funeral was held in the Philippines, with Arlyn's body finally returned to her homeland. Hundreds of people attended, many of them domestic workers who saw in Arlyn's fate a reflection of their own vulnerability, their own fears about what could happen to them in foreign countries where they had no protection and no voice. But even as her family mourned, investigators were working to piece together what had happened to Arlyn in her final hours. The forensic examination revealed details that were both heartbreaking and crucial to understanding how she died. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation. There were fractures to the hyoid bone in her throat, injuries consistent with manual strangulation. Someone had choked the life out of her with their bare hands. This wasn't a crime of passion, a momentary loss of control. Strangulation takes time, several minutes of sustained pressure. The killer would have watched Arlyn struggle, seen the terror in her eyes, felt her body fighting for air, and continued squeezing until she went limp. It was personal, intimate, and absolutely brutal. There were other injuries as well. Her skull showed signs of blunt force trauma, indicating she had been struck in the head, possibly knocked unconscious before being strangled. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms, proof that she had tried to fight back, that she had struggled for her life. Traces of carpet fibers were found embedded in her clothing, fibers that didn't match anything from her room at the villa, but could have come from a car trunk or another location where her body had been kept before being transported to the desert. The watch that had been buried with her, stopped at 11:37, might have been damaged during the struggle, potentially giving investigators a timeline for when a murder occurred. Armed with this forensic evidence, police brought Rashid in for questioning again. This time, the atmosphere was different. This wasn't a missing person inquiry anymore. This was a murder investigation, and Rashid was the prime suspect. His lawyers tried to block the interrogation, arguing that police had no direct evidence linking their client to the crime. But the circumstantial evidence was mounting. Rashid had the motive, he had the opportunity, and he had already been caught lying multiple times about the circumstances of Arlyn's disappearance. Investigators pressed him hard, confronting him with the inconsistencies in his story, with witness statements that contradicted his version of events, with the financial evidence that gave Arlyn a reason to blackmail him. Under pressure, Rashid's facade began to crack. He admitted that he had been having an affair with Arlyn, something he had previously denied. He admitted that his wife had found out about it and had been furious. He admitted that Arlyn had discovered information about his business dealings and had threatened to expose him unless he paid her. But he still insisted he had nothing to do with her death. He claimed that on the night she disappeared, they had met to discuss her demands. He said he had agreed to pay her, that they had parted on good terms, and that was the last time he saw her. He suggested that maybe she had been killed by someone else, perhaps someone involved in his business dealings who had learned she was a security risk. It was a convenient theory that conveniently shifted blame away from him. But investigators weren't buying it. They executed search warrants on all of Rashid's properties, including his villa, his office, and several other buildings he owned. They seized his vehicles and subjected them to forensic examination. In one of his cars, a luxury sedan he used personally, forensic technicians found traces of blood in the trunk. The blood had been cleaned, but not well enough. Modern forensic techniques can detect blood even after extensive cleaning attempts. DNA testing showed the blood belonged to Arlyn. They also found carpet fibers in the trunk that matched the fibers found on Arlyn's clothing. The evidence was damning. Arlyn had been in that trunk, almost certainly after she was already dead or dying. Confronted with this physical evidence, Rashid finally changed his story one more time. Through his lawyers, he offered a new version of events. He admitted that yes, Arlyn had been in his car. He claimed that their meeting that night had gone badly, that she had become hysterical and threatening, that she had attacked him, and that he had defended himself. He said her death was an accident, that he had only meant to restrain her, not to kill her. Panicked by what had happened, he had put her body in his car and driven out to the desert to bury it. He expressed remorse, said he'd been living with guilt and fear every day since it happened, that he wanted to finally tell the truth. It was a calculated move, an attempt to make this look like manslaughter rather than premeditated murder, to reduce his potential sentence by claiming self-defense and accident rather than intentional killing. But the forensic evidence told a different story. The pattern of injuries on Arlyn's body was not consistent with someone defending themselves against an attacker. The strangulation, the sustained pressure required to kill someone that way, the time it would have taken, these facts contradicted any claim of accident or panic. Investigators believed that Rashid had lured Arlyn to a meeting under the pretense of paying her the money she had demanded. Instead, he had killed her, probably in a location where he felt safe and in control, then transported her body to the desert and buried it. The land where she was found was part of a development project owned by one of Rashid's shell companies. He would have known the area, known it was isolated, known that construction hadn't started yet and might not for months or years. It was the perfect place to hide a body, or so he thought. The trial of Rashid became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in Dubai's recent history. The courtroom was packed every day with journalists, human rights observers, and members of the Filipino community who wanted to see justice for Arlyn. The prosecution presented a comprehensive case built on forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the documented history of Rashid's lies and contradictions. They painted a picture of a powerful man who had exploited a vulnerable woman, who had made her promises he never intended to keep, and who had ultimately murdered her when she became a threat to his wealth and freedom. The defense argued that Rashid was being persecuted because of prejudice against wealthy locals, that the evidence was circumstantial, that doubts remained about exactly what happened that night. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the verdict came down. Rashid was found guilty of premeditated murder. The judge cited the forensic evidence, particularly the manner of death and the elaborate cover-up that followed, as proof that this was not an accident or a crime of passion, but a calculated killing. Rashid was sentenced to life in prison. In the UAE, life imprisonment means 25 years behind bars. For a man who had lived in luxury his entire life, who had never faced consequences for his actions, who had believed his money and connections made him untouchable, the sentence was devastating. His lawyers immediately filed appeals, a process that continues to this day. But Rashid remains in prison while those appeals wind through the courts. For Arlyn's family, the verdict brought a measure of closure, but it could never bring back what they had lost. Her daughter grew up without her mother, raised by her grandmother in the Philippines. The money Arlyn had sent home before her death helped pay for the child's education, a bittersweet legacy of a mother's sacrifice. The case sparked important conversations about the treatment of domestic workers in the Gulf states, about the power imbalances that leave migrant workers vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, about the need for better protections and oversight. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Arlyn's story is how easily it could have been covered up completely. If that construction crew hadn't stumbled upon her remains, if the desert had kept its secrets, Rashid might never have faced justice. How many other Arlyns are out there? Women who disappeared without a trace, whose families never got answers, whose killers walked free because they had enough money and power to bury the truth along with the bodies. The reality is that we will never know. Arlyn's case only came to light because of a series of fortunate accidents and the refusal of her family and community to let her be forgotten. She left one message before vanishing. 8 words that became a cry for help that arrived too late. But in death, Arlyn Nusbron's story became something more than a tragedy. It became a warning about the dangers that migrant workers face, a testament to the persistence of families seeking justice, and a reminder that even the most powerful people are not above the law. Her legacy lives on in the reforms that her case helped inspire, in the awareness it raised, and in the memory of everyone who refuses to let her story be buried in the desert sand along with her body. Justice for Arlyn came slowly and at a terrible cost, but it came. And sometimes, in cases like these, that has to be enough.